there were a lot of things that happened during those first few days where, and some things came out, some things never came out, but there was a lot of eye rolling and a lot of laughing at Guppy. Not Benedict Marsh so much, but Guppy was a bit of a ham.
Yeah.
He played it up to the hilt, but he overplayed it. And although I was a young detective at the time, I may have been a detective, if I'm correct, 3 years at that point. I was all of 30 years old, and basically no experience in insurance fraud.
Yeah.
Enough experience in talking to people. But I had worked with some very good detectives who were older than me, more experienced with me than I was, and they were catching things along the way that were being said and whispering in my ear. What's going on here? What is it? And my partner at the time, a very, very good detective, had said there's something not right about this, and that was day one. Maybe by 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Can you remember any of the particular things? Any of the particular things that didn't ring true?
I can. What things? The first thing that stood out immediately was Guppy. I mean, from the time I showed up at the crime scene, police officers were laughing at him. Not to his face, but they had placed him in another room. And they were laughing at the way he was crying and carrying on. And it was just overboard. That in itself didn't lend to any suspicions, but the crime scene itself was suspicious. And the crime scene itself was suspicious not immediately, not when you first look at it, you walk in and say, this is bogus. But when you go back to your office, and you start processing information, you start replaying things in your head, and you say, well, this wasn't right, or this looked a little funny. And the way it works in New York City Police Department, unlike what you might see on television with NYPD Blue or the CSI shows of today, we have a crime scene unit. Their only job is to process evidence in the crime scene. And they don't go out and interview anybody. They don't arrest anybody. I call them in. They process the crime scene. They take the evidence, they voucher the evidence for safekeeping or for further processing, and they join me back at my office at some point during that same day to go over what they've done. Some cases I stick around and ask them to do certain things. I need things taken from that safe, right? In this case, I showed up at the crime scene. We did our initial interviews, spoke to Guppy, spoke to Marsh, talked to the maids, the doormen, the housekeepers, whatever we could do. Got our crime scene people in there, knocked on some doors, and then got them out of the crime scene, got them back to my office. And a few hours later, the crime scene unit detectives came in, and they said it's a strange crime scene. Never seen anything like it. And I said, why? And the first thing he said was the gunshot in the room was phony. And I said, why is that? And he took out I'm not sure I recall what it was, the sheet of the bedspread or the pillow, but he showed that it was a revolver that was used. He could tell so immediately by the gunpowder spray, and that it was held closely against the bed. And for argument's sake, I'm going to say it was against the mattress and a pillow placed on top of it. I don't recall it exactly. I could find it in my notes. And then when it was fired, you had gunpowder residue on both top and bottom. And it actually had the outline of the gun. The description of the crime itself from the victims was that they were laying face down on the bed, and then a gun was fired, pointed and fired towards one of them into the bed. It didn't agree with the forensics. The forensics showed that the gun was placed much lower, rather than pointing down like this. If I can, maybe I'll back up a little.
Yeah.
That's the way it was described. The forensics showed that it was done this way.
Yeah.
And it was held close to the bed. so as not to penetrate through the mattresses, not to go through the floor. It was, so it didn't make any sense. It looked like they were intentionally. It was more done to muffle the gunshot than it was to fire around and scare someone. That was the first thing. The second thing was.
And by the way, that's absolutely true.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I'm sitting here saying this. I've never actually talked about that. And I was waiting for you to say, well, no, that's not what I did.
No, that's absolutely bang on. Absolutely correct.
So they were accurate. I guess our crime scene guys are pretty good.
Yeah.
What was used to tie up Darius and Benedict? It came out during the next few hours that, especially the older detectives in my unit, we started talking about it, and this was a big crime in New York. The precinct that it occurred in was the 17th, which is probably one of the richest areas in all of New York. A lot of old money. So when any crime happens there, it's front page usually. And a lot of the older guys were looking at this, and I don't remember whether it was I who noticed it or somebody else noticed it, but we started talking about the twine that was used to tie them up. Nobody had ever seen it before. All the courses that I had taken, and whether it be kidnapping seminars and homicide, 3 weeks of homicide investigations, and they talk about knots used to tie victims and how we safeguard those. When we actually discussed it, nobody had ever seen one. Duct tape is what was used in New York City and probably most of the country. It's easier, it's quicker, much tougher to get out of, and readily available. So all the victims we had seen, both murder victims and robbery victims, were always, if they were tied up in the first place, were tied up with duct tape. If not duct tape, and they were, a ligature was used, it was usually an extension cord, an electrical extension cord, or a cord from a lamp or a telephone cord, something local to the crime scene itself. The perpetrator may have forgotten to bring along a ligature, something to tie up his victim, and so he'll use what he can find. But if he's going to go as far as to bring something along, you bring along duct tape. You don't bring along twine. So that stood out. The ropes weren't tied tight. They were both able to get away. They wanted
to be able to free themselves. I don't understand that.
Yeah.
Still, it's phony, but that's what they wanted.
Well, yeah, of course. But a lot of these things stood out. And again, you have to understand, we're human beings. I'm not a computer and process information and say, oh, what he just said is a lie. Or sometimes it's like life. Somebody says something to you, and you'll take it for what it's worth at face value, and then days go on, and you hear other things, and you say, wait a second, that person was lying to me. So none of this, we didn't know they were lying initially from the start, but there was skepticism. And the skepticism grew as the day wore on. Other things happened. Later on that evening, I had taken them. We had what was called a catch unit, CATCH, catching criminals. I don't recall what it stood for exactly. Computer assisted, criminal hunt. Computer assisted terminal criminal hunt. Yeah. Basically, it was a large building where we held photographs of perpetrators of crimes. This is much prior to the way computers work today, but it was wonderful at the time. The photographs were broken down by race, then by height, then by hair color, then by crime, then by area. And so what we could do is, if you were the victim of a robbery on 30th Street and First Avenue in Manhattan, say over by the UN, we would actually pull out known perpetrators who've been arrested committing crimes in that area for robberies that matched your description. If you said they were approximately 6 feet, we'd bring them out from maybe 5'8" to 6'2", just in case you were a little off.
Mm-hmm.
So every perpetrator arrested in that area for a robbery that was 5'8" to 6'2" would be brought out. And then if you said they had brown hair or blonde hair, we would narrow it down. And we would do the best we could at narrowing it down. In this case, we narrowed it down pretty well. We were looking at white males, blonde hair, over 6 feet tall, medium build and not too heavy, not too fat. The clean shaven doesn't matter, or mustaches don't matter. We tell people to ignore that anyway. And what we brought out matched the description. So we brought out trays and trays of Polaroid photographs of robbers who matched that or your description. Literally thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs. Now, bear in mind, if you're the victim of a robbery, most victims do not recall specific details unless they spend an enormous amount of time with the perpetrator of the crime, or unless they're forced to look at the perpetrator's face constantly. In this case, Guppy and Marsh had claimed the perpetrator said, "Don't look at my face. Look away." Forced them to look down at the bed. I think Marsh or Guppy might have said that when they were being led to the bathroom, they kind of glanced back at him, and he yelled at them again, "Don't look at my face." So they got a look at his face. Well, when you get a look at someone's face, enough that you can give a description, but not enough to maybe draw them yourself to give accurate details of moles, scars, but just enough to say, look, he was this tall, he had blonde hair. Other than that, I'm not too sure. Well, when I hand you 10,000 photographs of people, blonde hair, that tall, maybe with that particular type of facial features, and you're asked to look at the photograph. I'm not asking you to be sure that it's them. I just want you to say, does it resemble them? Pick out photographs that may resemble the person who committed the crime.